Okay, so as I promised in the previous lesson, if you had any problems understanding how map and flat map and the rest of the code work, what I'm going to do in this lesson, as you can see from the code over here, is I've added a bunch of print line statements over here that are going to help us debug map and flat map. And as we scroll down here to our main method, I've also added some additional print line methods to our FG and H functions as well. So the rest of the code remains the same. This part right here is the same. This part here is essentially the same. If you're interested in this code on GitHub, that is the URL right there. It's called Debuggable in Detail under my username, Alvin J. Again, the way this lesson is going to work is I'm going to show the same code as the previous lesson, but with many print line statements added for debugging purposes. And then after we see this code over here, I'll show the output it produces, and we'll walk through that. And I believe all of this output will help explain the code over here. So let's take a look at the code over here. We have the same map method signature as before. We see this print statement right there that's going to say that we're entering map. And what I do at this point is, one change I have made here is that this is still called value right there, but this is now called message. I did change that, I see. So again, we entered the map function, and these are the two initial values. Now we calculate that next value by applying the function to the value. And then we have on that line right there, we show the next value right there. And to be clear, this next value, when we apply that function, this next value here is going to be an int. So I can get rid of that comment right there and get rid of that comment as well. So now that's the next value. And then I show that I'm leaving map. And then when I leave map, I create this new debuggable right there. And then flat map is similar. We entered flat map right there. This one says our value and message. Now we create next value here. And in this case, next value is going to be a debuggable. And we can tell that because we're calling the function f here, and f transforms an int to a debuggable as I show up there. So we know next value is a debuggable. And then before leaving flat map, I show that the message, the original message was that one. And then the next value is here, and the next message is that one there. And then we're leaving flat map right there. Okay, so that covers those print line statements. And then the functions down here, all I did was add this print line statement right there. So this is to help indicate that you entered the function f, and then the value a was equal to $a right there. So if for some reason that's not easy to read, I'll go ahead and fix that one. Then I just did the same things in G and H right there. And I apologize. One other thing I may have done here was change our message. Yeah, so I changed the message right here, the logging message. So this is our new logging message. So it shows that F received the input $a, and then our result is that right there. So we have this new logging message as we go through as well. As I mentioned before, it may help to understand how the for expression is translated. Our for expression is shown right here. And here, this is the Scala 2 version of that for expression. What you could do in Scala 2, which is really nice, was you could issue this command, and then you could dig through its output, and you would find something that looks like this. So you would find that the final result there is equal to this. When you read this code, it's very interesting because now it says the very first thing that happens is you apply the function f to the value 100. And then when that function returns, you then call flat map using that result value right there. So it looks like I changed the parameter names, but this f result here is the same as that one right there. But again, f is applied to 100, then flat map is called on that result, and then that result right here is passed into G right there. So now what happens is G is executed right there, and when it's finished running, flat map is called on it, and then the G result comes out of there. It's passed into the H function right here. So now the H function runs, and when it's finished, it calls map. So that's the very last call. And then out of map comes that H result. And then all we're doing here is returning hrez. So that's what we do right here is we return hrez. So as I showed in my previous videos, any algorithm you would have here in the yield block is what you would find in this area right here. But for our purposes, this is just simple. It's just a return of that H result value right there. And before we move on, the other thing to note is, again, we have the two flat map calls here and here, followed by one map call. And as I noted in the previous lesson, the map call is the last function to be entered, and then it's the first one to leave. So it's the last one to be entered right here, and then it's the first one to leave. As soon as this map is finished, then the calls start to unwind. We come back up here. That flat map finishes. We come back up here, and then that flat map finishes. And then finally, the result comes up here. So that's the way this decompiled code works. Now on the next page, I show the output. So let's go ahead and give that a try. So we will do Scala CLI, and I call this debuggable details. So if I scroll backwards right there, now we need to strike a balance between seeing that output and the input. And actually what I'm thinking is, because this output right here is the same as that output over there, it might help us to look at the code over here. So let's focus on the output over here and the code over here while we're looking at this. So the first output we see is that f of a equals 100. So what's going on is the for expression starts, and then f is applied to 100 right here. So now when we go look at the f function right here, we can see that output come from here. So f of a equals 100. That tells us a was 100. Then the result is a times 2, so that should be 200. So note that here I don't print that result, but what I do is I create a new debuggable. I pass that result into the debuggable, and I also create this string when I'm constructing debuggable. So that's going to be our new string. This is going to be created first, and then debuggable will be called with this value right there. So when we come over here, we see that we've entered flat map. Our value is going to be 200, and that's the value we got right there. And then our message inside of flat map is going to be constructed by that right there. And that says that our input was 100 and our result is now 200. So one way to think about this, and there's no good way for me to highlight this, is that we've now left the f function. That is run. Now we're going into the flat map process. So if I come over here, F100 is run. Now we've entered the flat map process over here. So that's what's going on here, is the flat mapping. And now when that flat mapping finishes, what's going to happen is that we go into the G function. So now we see that output here. We've entered G and A equals 200. And that output comes from that line right there. So then that next value, which is going to be 600, is calculated. And then we dive into debuggable again with the same string, or the same string format that we had earlier. So now we enter flat map after the value G has been calculated up here. So you can see G's input was 200 and its result is 600. So now you can see the pattern over here is that we enter the function and we have a value. And then once that function calls debuggable, we enter flat map over here. From flat map, we enter the next function, which is G, and once that debuggable is called, we enter flat map again in this area. And then that leads to the function H being called. And then when H is run, since it's the last one in the loop over here, or the last one over here, what happens there is we now enter the map function. And I use these arrow symbols here to try to show that we've entered map, and I should scroll up over here to map. So we've entered map. The value is 2400, and then our message is going to be this message right here. And then we calculate next value, which I print out right there, and then I show that I'm leaving map. So we actually, in this case, we enter map, do all this, and then we leave map, and we come out of that. Now we start coming out, and now if I go back here, you can start to think that, okay, H was run, it called map, and then map was run. So all of this code is done now. So what happens now is we're leaving this code block and we're coming backwards up the loop. So you can think that we're coming out of here, we're going back up to here into this flat map. And then when that's done, we're going to back out again and come up to this flat map. And then when that's done, we'll come over here to the result. That's the way that should work right there. And now you can see that we've left map right there. And now we're getting output from flat map. So you could see, if we look at these print statements right here, you'll see that they coincide with these print statements right here, here, and here. So this is the innermost flat map. and it's saying I received the value 200 and its result was 600. Now the next value is going to be 2400. That's coming from that line right there. And then the next message is going to be here. So it comes from the H function that said its input was 600 and its result is 2400. So that comes from this message right here. And then we see that it's leaving flat map. So what's going to happen is it leaves that flat map. It goes back to the previous flat map as I showed before. And now we'll start to see output from that one. So this was earlier in the recursion, if you want to think about that. So if I go back here, the previous output we had was from this flat map, and now we should be getting output from this flat map here. And note that 100 was what came into this flat map. So when we come down here, I just covered that one. Now we see the input was 100, the result was 200. The next val is going to be 2400. And now you see that the next message is accumulating. So we had an initial message from H right here, and then I prepended a G message to that one. So you can see how the message is now accumulating and how we're also keeping that final value right there. So then we leave that flat map call. And now we get the final result message. So what happens over here is this final result there has been calculated. And now we come down to these print statements right here. And if I go back here, you can see that we have that final result. So all of the unwinding has happened. So we came out of this map, we went in this flat map, we came out of that one and came back into this one. And now that we're done with those, we have a final result value over here. And similarly, that's how the for expression worked over there. And now we're getting this output again from their final result. So we show that the final value is the value that's in the final result. And that is the 2400 that we show right here. And then we print the final message, and that's the message from the final result, which again is right there. And that message is these 3 lines of output right there. So hopefully that gave a fairly good explanation of how things work over here. And if you have a copy of Functional Programming Simplified, the first version, a copy of the PDF, then you'll see on the next several pages, I cover everything that I just spoke about. So I'm going to flip through those pages and show how I explain things here. So I talked about the F function and then the first flat map being called. Then I showed that code. Then as we go through that code, I show how that result gets fed into G right there. And then I discuss what happens inside of G. Then I show how the flat map is reached. So at this point, we've come out of G, and now we've started the next flat map, and we're sending the G result into H. Actually, I note on the next page, the flat map calls haven't returned yet. That's kind of a key point. And I note that you are right here right now. We're just about to go into H. But I discussed that already, so I'm just going to flip forward here. So I discussed that H is executed now, and then once it's done, map is entered. So what's going on is H was called right there, and then map is entered right there like that. And that produces this output. Again, I go through map source code, then I show how the flat map calls unwind right there. And again, on this next page, all about how map and flat map unwind, and then how we get to the final result. So I covered all that in this video, and I just wanted to show you those pages. So if you want to reference those pages, you can now just rewind a little bit and see the content of each of those pages. And then the other thing I do here at the end is that I encourage you to change the source code, work with the source code and modify it until you're completely comfortable with how these things work. So if there's anything you don't like over here, like I was pausing earlier because I wanted to say that I entered each of these functions. So I would say something like the F function, and then I entered the G function and I entered H right there. So then if we recompile that, that output is a little bit better. Another thing I might like is just to change those print lines to prints and see what that looks like. So do that and print that. That condenses that output, and I like that a bit more. So now I can see that I entered F a little bit more clearly without that extra blank space. I entered F, and then I had that value, and then I'm going into flat map right there. And another thing up here you might want to do is say, well, I have that result here, so print line. So I actually like these two changes here so far for myself in terms of trying to make sense of what I'm doing here. And the next thing I might do would be to get a new message. Okay, so that looks even better. I like what I've done here. I can see now that I'm entering F and I have that value of 100. Then I do my calculation, I get the result is 200, and then I'm also calling debuggable with this information. So if I were to copy this over to G and H, I think I'd be really happy with this new output. So I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader, but if you like this new format, just go ahead and make those changes, or again, make whatever changes you want until you're completely comfortable with how this code works over here. And also, I should mention that the reason you want to be completely comfortable with this is because the lessons that follow are going to continue to build on this knowledge. So, what I do in the book next is I create a generic version of our debuggable type. And then what I'm going to do after that is convert the debuggable to use a list instead of a string. And then when we get to the end of this lesson, we're going to have a really nice, stunning conclusion about everything we've done in these video courses that's led up to this point and what we're actually doing here.